Upon seeing the photo in the millionaire's office, the cleaner shouted, "Boss, that boy was from my orphanage." Subscribe to the channel and comment on where you are watching from. The unmistakable aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air of the elegant office on the 32nd floor of one of Manhattan's most modern buildings. The tempered glass windows offered a stunning view of the magnificent city where the Statue of Liberty stood proudly against the skyline. It was a Tuesday morning, typical of a New York summer, with the golden sun filtering through the glass and creating reflections that danced over the imported walnut furniture. Mary Johnson, a 50-year-old woman with grey hair tied in a simple bun, moved with the precision of someone who knew every inch of that luxurious environment. Her brown eyes, marked by the wrinkles of time and the wisdom of a life full of experiences, methodically scanned each object that needed cleaning. She wore the navy blue uniform of the cleaning company, always impeccable, because she believed that a person's dignity was not measured by the job they held, but by the pride with which they performed it. For 3 years, she had cleaned that office every Tuesday and Friday, always arriving at 7 in the morning when the building was still quiet. She knew the routine of the place like the back of her hand. First, she vacuumed the oriental rug that dominated the center of the room, then polished the conference table where important business decisions were made, and finally, she dedicated herself to the solid cedar bookshelves that occupied an entire wall of the space. That morning, something different caught her attention. A slight vibration in the building, perhaps caused by the strong wind blowing in from the sea, had slightly displaced some objects on the highest shelf. Mary grabbed the stool she always used to reach the most difficult places and carefully began to reorganize the trophies, plaques, and picture frames that were there. "Be careful, Mary," she murmured to herself, recalling the advice she always gave to the children at the St. Joseph's home, where she had worked for so many years. "Slow and steady wins the race." It was then that her foot slipped slightly on the stool. It wasn't a serious fall, just a small imbalance, but enough for her hand to knock against a silver frame. That was in the corner of the shelf. The object fell with a dull thud onto the rug, and Mary quickly bent down to pick it up, worried that she had damaged something valuable. As she crouched, her eyes fixed on the photograph that had slipped out of the frame. It was a black-and-white image, slightly yellowed with age, showing a boy of about 10 years old. The boy wore a simple school uniform, a white shirt and navy blue pants, and held a small soccer trophy in his hands. But it wasn't the clothing or the award that made Mary's heart race like a drum in a parade. It was the eyes, those dark, deep and melancholic eyes that seemed to hold secrets too big for a child. The shape of the face, the line of the jaw, the way the hair fell over the forehead. Every detail of that face was etched in her memory with the precision of someone who had dedicated 25 years of her life to caring for abandoned children. "It can't be," she whispered, and her hands began to tremble uncontrollably. It was him. It was David, the boy who had arrived at St. Joseph's home in Springfield on a rainy June night exactly 25 years ago. Mary remembered that night as if it were yesterday. She was on duty when an elegant woman brought the boy, claiming to have found him lost on the street. But Mary's sharp instincts, developed over years of caring for children in vulnerable situations, told her that there was more to that story. David was different from the other children in the home, not just because of his refined upbringing and the mannerisms that hinted at a more affluent background, but mainly because of the way he absorbed knowledge. He had a brilliant intelligence and an impressive memory for numbers and strategies. By the age of 10, he was already solving math problems that challenged much older teenagers. "Aunt Mary," he used to say with his sweet and polite voice, "when I grow up, I'm going to have a big company and help all the children in the world who don't have families." Mary closed her eyes, feeling the tears burn behind her eyelids. She remembered the afternoon when a wealthy family came to the home interested in adopting David. She had felt her heart break at the hope in the boy's eyes, but she also sensed that something was off about those potential adoptive parents. There was too much coldness, too much calculation, and not enough genuine love. When the director of the home offered her the opportunity to adopt David herself, Mary spent the entire night awake, torn between the love she felt for the boy and the responsibility she carried for the other 53 orphans who depended on her. In the end, she made the most painful decision of her life, to stay at the home to care for all the children who needed her, giving up her own maternal happiness. "God forgive me," she murmured now, holding the photograph against her chest. "God forgive me for not being selfish at that moment." The sound of the elevator door opening made her snap back to reality. Quickly she wiped her eyes and placed the photograph back in the frame, positioning it back on the shelf. She pretended to be busy cleaning when she heard the firm and determined footsteps she recognized all too well. Eduardo Mendes Carvalho, 35 years old, entered the office with his imposing presence. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with dark hair. Always perfectly styled, he wore a tailored suit that cost more than Mary earned in 6 months. His eyes, those same melancholic eyes she had just recognizing the photograph, they moved through the space with the authority of someone commanding a business empire valued in hundreds of millions of dollars. "Good morning, Mary," he said politely, but without warmth, heading straight for her desk. "Good morning, Dr. Edward," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions she felt. Mary discreetly observed him as he organized the papers on the walnut desk. Each gesture, each mannerism, confirmed her suspicions. The way he tapped his fingers when he was deep in thought, the way he tilted his head to the right when focused, the habit of fiddling with his left wrist when nervous. It was David, her boy. The child she had rocked through nights of nightmares, the one she had taught to tie his shoes, the one she had comforted when he missed a family that perhaps had never truly existed. And now here he was, transformed into one of the most powerful businessmen in New York, with no idea who she really was, unaware that the woman who cleaned his office twice a week had been the person who loved him most in the early years of his conscious life. The phone rang, and Edward answered with his deep professional voice. Mary continued her cleaning, but her mind was racing. How to approach the situation, how to reveal such an impactful truth. And most importantly, would he remember her after all this time? As she polished a bronze trophy, Mary made a decision. She would not rush. She would observe, investigate discreetly, and only then decide how to proceed. After all, 25 years had passed, and both she and David, now Edward, were completely different people. But one thing she knew for sure, fate had placed that photograph in her hands for a reason, and she would not waste this second chance that life offered her to be near the boy she had always considered her son at heart. 2 weeks had passed since the discovery of the photograph, and Mary felt as if she were living in 2 parallel worlds. During the day, she maintained her usual routine, meticulous cleaning, professional discretion, and the polite cordiality that characterized her work, but inside, a storm of emotions and memories consumed her, making each moment in the office a mix of joy for being near David and anguish for him not recognizing her. That Friday morning, she arrived at the office 15 minutes early, as she always did. The rising sun painted the New York sky with shades of orange and pink, and the city began to awaken down below. Mary positioned her cleaning supplies in the small service closet and started her routine, but this time with an additional goal to observe Edward more closely, looking for signs of the boy she had once known so well. Edward arrived promptly at 8 o'clock as usual. He wore a navy-tailored suit that accentuated his dark eyes, and he carried a cup of coffee and a pastry from the French bakery on the ground floor of the building. Mary noticed that he had ordered his coffee without sugar, exactly how David always preferred his hot chocolate at St. Joseph's Home, claiming that too much sweetness made him nauseous. "Good morning, Mary," he greeted, heading to his desk. "Good morning, Dr. Edward. Are you well? You seem a bit tired," she dared to comment, slightly breaking the protocol of distance she always maintained. Edward paused for a moment and looked at her more attentively. "It hasn't been easy to sleep lately. Constant nightmares." "What kind of nightmares, if you don't mind my indiscretion?" Mary asked, pretending to arrange some books on the nearby shelf. "Strange things," he sighed, sitting in his Italian leather chair. "Smells, mostly. Bean soup, powdered soap, hospital disinfectant. And there are always children crying in the background, but I can never see them clearly." Mary's heart raced. Those were exactly the odours that dominated the dining hall and dormitories of St. Joseph's Home. It was as if Edward's unconscious memory was trying to surface through his dreams. "It must be work stress," she commented, trying to keep her voice neutral. "You work a lot." "Maybe," Edward murmured, but his expression revealed that he knew there was something deeper behind those recurring dreams. For the next 2 hours, Mary observed every gesture of Edward as he worked. And then she noticed the first unmistakable sign. When he finished drinking his coffee, he automatically folded the paper napkin into the shape of a boat, smoothing the creases with the meticulous care of someone repeating a familiar ritual. Mary nearly dropped the duster she was holding. That was the same technique she had taught David during the preparations for the St. Joseph's Home's June festival, when they made paper boats to decorate the dining hall. It was such a specific gesture, so unique in the way he folded and refolded the tips, that it could not be a coincidence. "What a lovely little boat," she commented, approaching the desk to pick up a pen that had accidentally fallen to the floor. Edward looked at the folded napkin in his hands as if he was seeing it for the first time. "I don't know why I do this. It's automatic. Since I was a child, whenever I have paper in my hands, I end up making these boats." "It's quite a specific technique," Mary observed. "Someone must have taught you when you were little." "It must have been," he agreed, but his brow furrowed in concentration, although I can't remember who. Mary felt a lump in her throat. How to explain that it had been she who spent hours teaching that folding technique to a sad boy who missed a family? How to tell him that those paper boats had been a way to distract him from the nights he cried softly, calling for a mother he might have never known? The phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was Marcia, Edward's secretary, informing him that Mary was at the reception. "You can send her up," Edward said, and Mary noticed a subtle change in his posture. His shoulders tensed, his jaw clenched slightly, and he tucked the paper boat into the drawer of his desk as if it were something embarrassing. A few minutes later, Helen Carter entered the office like a gust of elegance and imported perfume. At 42, she was a stunning woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, sun-kissed skin from frequenting the best spas in the city, and a Chanel dress that cost more than Mary earned in a year. Her grey-blue eyes scanned the room with the superiority of someone born with a silver spoon. "Edward, darling," she said, kissing her husband's cheek without actually touching her lips to his skin. "We need to talk about tomorrow's dinner. The senator confirmed his attendance, and you know how important it is to maintain these relationships." "Of course, Helen," Edward replied with a cordiality that seemed rehearsed, "but I'm busy right now. Can we talk at home?" Helen finally noticed Mary, who was discreetly polishing a nearby shelf. Her gaze was cold and evaluative, as if she were assessing whether the employee posed any kind of threat or was simply human furniture. "Who is this?" Helen asked, in a tone that made no effort to hide her disdain. Mary, our cleaning assistant, Edward explained. She has worked here for 3 years. 3 years? Helen raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. I didn't know we had permanent staff. I thought the cleaning. Our company sent different people. Mary is very competent, Edward defended, and Mary felt a pang of gratitude. I prefer to keep the same person. It's a matter of safety and trust. Helen approached Mary with calculated steps. What is your full name? She asked in a tone that felt more like an interrogation. Mary Johnson, ma'am, she replied, keeping her head down and her hands busy with the cleaning cloth. And how long have you been working in cleaning? About 15 years, ma'am. Before that I worked at a children's home. Mary noticed Edward jerk his head up sharply at the mention of home. His eyes fixed on her with an intensity he hadn't shown before, as if something had awakened in his mind. Children's home? Helen repeated with disdain. What kind of work did you do there? I took care of the children, ma'am. I helped with feeding, homework and recreational activities. It was like being a mother to 50 children at once, Mary explained, discreetly observing Edward's reaction. That must have been interesting, Helen commented with little interest, but Edward continued to look at Mary with an expression she couldn't decipher. Which home did you work at? Edward suddenly asked, standing up from his chair. St. Joseph's Home in Springfield, Mary replied, feeling her heart pound so hard she feared they could hear it. Edward fell silent for a long moment. His right hand instinctively went to his left wrist, where Mary knew there was a small crescent-shaped scar, the result of a fall from the water tank at the home when he was 8 years old. She had taken care of the wound herself, applying iodine and bandaging it every day until it healed. St. Joseph's, he repeated slowly, as if testing how the words sounded, in his mouth. That name sounds familiar. Helen looked from Edward to Mary with a growing expression of suspicion. Edward, are you all right? You look pale. I'm fine, he lied, running a hand through his hair, another gesture Mary recognized from when he was a child and nervous. It's just that sometimes I feel like I've been to that place, Springfield. That's impossible, Helen said categorically. You were raised in the suburbs, in our house. You never lived anywhere in the area. Edward nodded, but Mary noticed that his expression remained confused, as if he were trying to fit pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense. The phone rang again, this time with the call Edward had been waiting for from São Paulo. He had to answer, and Helen quickly said goodbye, not without casting one last suspicious glance at Mary. When they were alone again, Edward remained silent for a long time, looking out the window at the city below. Mary continued her work, but she felt that something fundamental had changed between them. It was as if a door that had been closed for 25 years had begun to crack open. Mary, Edward said suddenly without turning around, do you remember all the children you cared for at the home? Every single one of them, Dr. Edward, she replied sincerely. They were my heart's children. A mother never forgets. And did they remember you, even after they grew up? Mary felt her eyes fill with tears. Some did. Some came back to visit me, to tell me how their lives were. It was my greatest joy. Edward finally turned to look at her, and Mary was sure that for a brief moment, behind the eyes of the successful businessman, she glimpsed the scared boy she once knew. It must be comforting, he said softly, to know that you positively impacted so many lives. It is, Dr. Edward. It truly is. The weekend passed slowly for Mary, who found herself unable to focus on anything other than the situation with Edward. She lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment in the suburbs, a simple but cozy place she had earned through hard work and savings. The walls were decorated with photographs of dozens of children from the home, Her children she had never forgotten. That Sunday night, sitting in her floral upholstered armchair, she opened a shoebox she had kept under her bed for years. Inside were her diaries from her time at the home, simple notebooks where she recorded details about each child, their food preferences, fears, dreams, and progress. In the school, significant episodes. It was a habit she had developed to better care for each of them. With trembling hands, she searched for the notes about David. Everything was there. The date of his arrival at the shelter, June 15th, 1999. The description of the elegant woman who had brought him, blonde hair, expensive dress, too nervous for someone who had simply found a lost child, and mainly all the little details that now made sense when observing Edward. David has frequent nightmares, she had written in July 1999. Always with the same elements. Authoritative voices arguing, the sound of a door slamming, the smell of expensive perfume mixed with cigarette smoke. When he wakes up, he cries softly, calling for someone he only refers to as "Dear Mommy." Mary closed her eyes, remembering the nights she would get up to comfort him. David never shared details about his previous life, but she sensed there was something traumatic behind his arrival at the shelter. The child was too well-mannered, knew complex words for his age, but at the same time showed a deep fear of being abandoned again. On Monday, she arrived at the office determined to learn more about Edward's current life, but without raising suspicions. She had spent the entire Sunday planning how to approach the subject naturally. Edward arrived an hour late, something unusual for him. He wore the same tailored suit from the previous day, another atypical behavior, and his eyes had deep, dark circles. Mary immediately noticed that he carried a different kind of tension. "Good morning, Dr. Edward. How are you?" she asked with genuine concern. "I hardly slept," he admitted, throwing himself into his armchair. "Those nightmares came back, more intense, and now they have faces." Mary felt her heart race. "Faces? A woman," he said, massaging his temples, "with grey hair tied in a bun. She is always singing something in a language I can't identify, but somehow I understand. It's about a little bird that lost its nest." Mary almost dropped the bucket of water she was carrying. It was the lullaby in an indigenous language she had learned from her grandmother and used to sing to the children at the shelter when they had trouble sleeping. David always specifically asked for that song, saying it calmed him. "How interesting," she managed to say with a choked voice. "Do you know that language?" Edward looked at her in surprise. "That language? No, I never studied it. Why do you ask?" "The song you described sounds like a very old indigenous lullaby. My grandmother taught it to me when I was a child." "Was your grandmother indigenous?" "Yes, she was. She raised me when my mother died. She taught me many songs from her tradition. One of them was exactly about an orphaned little bird looking for a new nest." Edward fell silent, processing the information. You sang that song at the shelter?" "I did. It was one of the children's favorites. They said it helped them have good dreams." "How does it go?" Edward suddenly asked, standing up with an urgency that startled Mary. "Dr. Edward? The song. How does it go? I need to know." Mary looked around, ensuring they were alone in the office. In a low, melodic voice, she began to sing softly. "Little bird, lost your home. Flew in the dark, but you'll find someone to give you love, new family, new home." Edward froze for a moment, then began to visibly tremble. His hands went automatically to his face, and Mary saw tears streaming between his fingers. "How do you know that song?" he whispered. "Edward, Dr. Edward, Mary started, but was interrupted by the sound of the elevator opening. Helen entered the office accompanied by a tall, thin man about 50 years old, wearing an impeccable black suit. His hair was grey, slicked back, and he carried a leather briefcase that suggested professionalism and discretion. "Edward, dear," Helen said, but stopped abruptly upon seeing her husband's emotional state. "What happened? Are you crying?" Edward quickly wiped his eyes and tried to compose himself. "It's nothing, just a bad headache." Helen didn't seem convinced, but turned her attention to the man accompanying her. "This is Robert Smith, a private investigator. I hired his services for a family security matter." Mary felt the blood run cold in her veins. A private investigator? Did Helen suspect something? "Nice to meet you, Dr. Edward." Robert greeted Edward with a firm handshake. "Your wife hired me to investigate the employees who have access to your personal and business information. It's a precautionary measure, given your success in business." Edward looked from Helen to the investigator, clearly confused. "Employees? What employees?" "Well," Helen gestured discreetly toward Mary, "people who circulate in your work environment, who know your routine, who have access to sensitive information." Mary continued cleaning a shelf, pretending not to pay attention, but each word felt like a stab. Helen suspected her. "Helen, this is unnecessary," Edward protested. "Mary has worked here for 3 years. She's a trustworthy person." "Exactly for that reason," Helen replied coldly. "Close people can be more dangerous. And lately you've been different, distant. I thought maybe someone was exerting some kind of influence over you." Robert opened his briefcase and took out a notepad. "Ms. Mary Johnson, correct? I need to ask you a few questions. It's standard procedure." Mary turned slowly, feeling cold sweat trickle down her back. "Yes, sir." "Where were you born?" "In Springfield, right here in New York." "Family?" "I'm an only child. My mother died when I was 8. I was raised by my maternal grandmother." "And your work history?" "I worked 25 years at St. Joseph's Home in Springfield. After it closed, I started working in cleaning." Robert meticulously noted everything. "When did the shelter close?" 5 years ago. "Budget cuts. And do you have contact with former colleagues from there?" Mary hesitated for a moment. "Some, yes. Employees who they spread out to other shelters and institutions." "Do any of these contacts work in investigation, media, or activities that could compromise our clients' privacy?" "No, sir. They are just people who took care of children, like me." Edward watched the whole scene with an increasingly disturbed expression. "Helen, this is humiliating for Mary. She doesn't deserve to be treated as a suspect of something we don't even know what it is." "Edward," Helen said with forced patience, "I'm protecting our family. You can't be naive enough to trust anyone blindly." "Anyone?" Edward repeated, and Mary detected a note of irritation in his voice. "Mary is not just anyone. She—" Everyone looked at him, waiting for the end of the sentence that seemed to have gotten lost in his mind. "She what, dear?" Helen insisted. Edward ran his hand through his hair, that nervous gesture Mary knew all too well. "She reminds me of someone. I can't." "Explain." "Reminds you of who?" "I don't know," Edward admitted in frustration. It's like I already knew her from somewhere. There's something familiar about her." Robert looked up from his notes. "That's interesting. Ms. Johnson, did you know Dr. Carter before working here?" "No, sir," Mary replied, technically telling the truth. She knew David, not Edward Carter. "Are you sure? Have you never crossed paths anywhere? Hospital, school, social event?" "I'm sure, sir." Robert closed his notebook. "Very well. I will check your references and history. It's just standard procedure, nothing personal." After Helen and the detective left, the office fell into a tense silence. Edward stood by the window for long minutes while Mary tried to continue her work with trembling hands. "Mary," he finally said without turning around. "Yes, Dr. Edward." "That song, the indigenous lullaby." "Yes." "I know the rest of the lyrics. I don't know how, but I do." Mary felt tears burning in her eyes. "Do you remember?" "Not exactly," he admitted. "But it's here." He touched his chest over his heart. "It's inside, as if it's part of me." "Sometimes," Mary said carefully. "The most important memories are kept in the heart, not the mind." Edward finally turned to look at her. "Do you think it's possible for someone to completely forget their own childhood?" "I think when a child goes through very painful situations, the mind may try to protect them by erasing certain memories. But they never completely disappear. They wait for the right moment to come back." "And what if those memories change everything the person believes about themselves?" Mary looked directly into his eyes, those same melancholic eyes that had sought hers for comfort so many nights at the shelter. "Then maybe it's time to discover who she really is." The following days dragged on like an eternity for Mary. She knew the detective was investigating every aspect of her life, and the tension in the office had become almost palpable. Edward spent long periods in silence, lost in thoughts that seemed to torment him, while she tried to maintain the normality of her routine, even feeling that every move was being watched and analyzed. On Thursday of the following week, an unexpected situation would change everything. Mary arrived at the office and found Edward sitting on the floor with his back to the door, fiddling with something she couldn't see. As she approached, she realized he was scribbling something on a piece of paper with mechanical and unconscious movements. "Dr. Edward," she called softly, "is everything okay?" He startled as if coming out of a trance and quickly tried to hide the paper, but Mary had already seen enough to feel the world spin around her. On the paper was a detailed drawing, the floor plan of St. Joseph's home. Every corridor, every room, every architectural detail was there, drawn with the precision of someone who knew every inch of that place intimately. I don't know why I drew this," Edward said, getting up from the floor with the crumpled sheet in hand. "I was thinking of other things, and when I realized—" "Can I see?" Mary asked, trying to control the tremor in her voice. Edward hesitated, but then extended the paper. Mary opened it carefully and felt tears immediately. It was all there: the dining room where they had meals, the yard where the children played, the dormitories with their lined-up beds, and even the small garden in the back where she used to tell stories on Sunday afternoons. But what impressed her the most was a small detail that Edward had drawn in the lower right corner, a tall water tank with a small side ladder. It was exactly from there that David had fallen at 8 years old, leaving the scar she knew Edward still carried on his wrist. "Dr. Edward," she said, her voice choked, "where have you seen this place before?" "I don't know," he replied, running his hands over his face in frustration. "It just appeared in my head, as if I had lived there." "What if you had lived there?" Edward looked at her with a mixture of confusion and something that seemed like hope. "What do you mean?" Mary took a deep breath. It was now or never. "Dr. Edward, I need to tell you something. But first, can I see your left wrist?" "My wrist?" He frowned. "Why?" "Please, it's important." Reluctantly, Edward extended his left arm and rolled up his shirt sleeve. There it was, a small crescent-shaped scar, exactly as Mary remembered. "How did you know I had this scar?" "Because I took care of it when it happened," Mary replied, feeling tears streaming freely down her face. "You were 8 years old, Edward, or rather David. That was your name at the shelter." Edward recoiled as if he had been punched. "What are you saying?" "You arrived at St. Joseph's home on a June night in 1999. An elegant woman said she found you lost on the street, but I always knew there was more to that story. You stayed with us for 4—" "That's impossible," Edward stammered. "I've always lived with my family. Helen is right. I grew up in Manhattan." "Edward, look at this drawing. How would you explain knowing every detail of a place you've supposedly never been?" He looked at the paper in his hands, then at the scar on his wrist, then at Mary's face. Did you really know me when I was a child? I knew and loved you as if you were my own son, she confessed. You were special, Edward. Smart, sensitive, caring. You always said that when you grew up you would have a big company and help all the children in the world. Edward sat heavily in his armchair, as if his legs could no longer support him. The songs you sing, the paper boats. I taught you all of that. You loved making paper boats. You said they were ships that would one day take you to a family that truly loved you. My family loves me, Edward protested, but his voice sounded weak, lacking conviction. Edward, Mary approached him carefully. When you think of your childhood, what are your first memories? He remained silent for a long time, concentrating. It's strange. I can't remember anything before I was 12 or 13. Helen always said it was because I had a very high fever as a child that affected my memory. And you never questioned that? I did question it, but whenever I asked about my childhood, my mother, Mrs. Carter, would get very nervous. She said it was better not to dig into the past. Mary felt a wave of anger thinking about the woman who had taken David from the shelter and then built a life based on lies. Edward, do you remember the day you were adopted? Adopted? He raised his head abruptly. I wasn't adopted. I'm the biological son of the Carters. Are you sure about that? Of course I am. There are documents, a birth certificate. What if those documents were false? Edward stood up, agitated. Mary, what you're suggesting is... It's absurd. You're saying my whole life is a lie. I'm saying you deserve to know the truth about who you really are. And what would that truth be? Mary took a deep breath. The truth is that you arrived at our shelter traumatized and scared. It took months for you to be able to sleep through the night without nightmares. You talked about a big house, people shouting, being afraid of being alone in the dark. That doesn't prove anything. And the truth is that when you turned 12, a wealthy family showed interest in adopting you. I tried to dissuade the director because something didn't feel right about those people, but the donation they offered was too tempting for a shelter always struggling financially. Edward began to pace back and forth, clearly disturbed. Even if that's true, why didn't you tell me before? Why wait 3 years? Because I was scared, Mary admitted. Scared of being wrong, scared of ruining your life, scared that you wouldn't remember me. And now I see that you are suffering with these fragmented memories. I see that your soul is restless, searching for something you can't define, and I can no longer stay silent watching you like this. The phone rang, interrupting the tense moment. Edward answered mechanically. Dr. Carter, this is Robert Smith. I have some information about our investigation. Can I come up? Edward looked at Mary with an expression that mixed panic and determination. Yes, come up. After hanging up, he turned to her. Mary, I need you to promise me one thing. What? If what you're saying is true, if I really am this David, I want to know everything, but I need to find out for myself. Don't tell the detective anything yet. Edward, please, give me time to process this, to understand what this means. Mary nodded just as the elevator doors opened. Robert entered with his usual briefcase, but his demeanor was more serious than the last time. Dr. Carter, he greeted, then looked at Mary. Mrs. Johnson, it's actually good that you're here. I need to talk to both of you. Edward and Mary exchanged a nervous glance. I found some interesting inconsistencies, Robert continued, opening his briefcase. First, about you, Mary. Your background is clean, as expected. You really worked at St. Joseph's Home for 25 years, with excellent references. Mary felt a momentary relief. But, Robert continued, I also discovered something about you, Dr. Carter, that may interest you. Edward tensed. About me. Yes, I did a routine check on your personal documents and found some irregularities. What kind of irregularities? Your original birth certificate was amended when you were 12 years old. Before that, there was another record with another name. The silence in the office was deafening. Mary felt her heart race. What name? Edward asked in a hoarse voice. Robert consulted his notes. David Johnson, registered as an orphan in the public system until the age of 12, when he was officially adopted by the Carter family and had his documentation altered. Edward leaned against the table as if he were about to faint. David. Exactly, Robert continued, seeming not to notice the impact of his words. The interesting thing is that, according to the records, you spent the years between 8 and 12 in a foster care institution, coincidentally the same shelter where Mary worked. Edward looked at Mary with a mix of shock, gratitude, and something she interpreted as recognition. It was as if, finally, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Dr. Carter, Robert said, were you aware of this information? Edward took a moment to respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. No, but now a lot of things make sense. The silence that followed Robert's revelations seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the office. Edward remained leaning on the table, processing information that completely reshaped his perception of himself, while Mary felt a mix of emotions. Edward felt a mix of relief that the truth was finally coming to light and terror at what it could mean for everyone involved. Dr. Carter, Robert continued, misinterpreting the silence as mere surprise, I imagine it must be shocking to discover details about your adoption that were, let's say, omitted by your family. But this isn't necessarily problematic from a legal standpoint. Older adoptions sometimes had different procedures. Edward raised his eyes, and Mary saw a determination in them that hadn't been there moments before. Robert, I need to ask a direct question. What exactly was the purpose of the investigation my wife requested? The detective consulted his notes. To check for any suspicious connections between close employees and possible attempts at manipulation or blackmail. Your wife was concerned about changes in your behavior. What kind of changes? According to her, you've been more introspective, questioning, and she mentioned several times that you've been having disturbing dreams. She feared someone was exerting some kind of psychological influence over you. Edward looked at Mary, and she realized he was starting to understand the whole situation. Helen wasn't just being jealous or controlling. She was afraid that the truth about Edward's past would come to light. And what else did you find out? Edward asked. Well, Robert flipped. Through some pages, there are some interesting points about the time of your adoption. The Carter family made a substantial donation to St. Joseph's Home shortly before the process. And there are records indicating there was a certain urgency in the procedure. Urgency? Yes. Normally adoptions take months to finalize. Yours was completed in a matter of weeks, and there's a curious note in the files I managed to access. Edward leaned in. What note? A staff member at the shelter had made a formal contestation to the process. She claimed you were a particularly vulnerable child and needed more time to adjust to the idea of adoption. Mary felt her eyes welling up with tears. She had fought as hard as she could to protect David, but her objections had been ignored by the Carters' economic power. Who was that staff member? Edward asked, though Mary knew he already knew the answer. Robert checked the document. Mary Johnson, the same woman who now works in your office. The detective finally seemed to notice the tension in the room. He looked from Edward to Mary, noticing the emotional expressions on both their faces. Is there something I should know? He asked. Edward took a deep breath. Robert, I appreciate your work. Please prepare a complete report and send it to me. not to my wife, directly to me. Dr. Carter, and I need you to maintain absolute confidentiality about everything you've discovered. Do you understand? Of course, but no buts. This is a very delicate personal matter, and I need to process this information in my own time. After Robert left, promising to send the complete report in 48 hours, Edward and Mary were left alone with the weight of a truth that had been buried for 23 years. So, it's true, Edward finally said. I really am David. You've always been David to me, Mary replied softly, even when you didn't know who you were. Edward moved closer to her, studying her face as if seeing it for the first time. How could I forget? How is it possible to forget someone who was so important? Trauma can do that to a child. And if you were pressured to forget... Helen knew, Edward said suddenly. She always knew. That's why she got nervous when I asked about my childhood. That's why she hired the detective when I started. Having nightmares. Edward, my whole life is based on lies, he continued, his voice taking on a tone of bitterness. My name, my family, my identity, all false. Not everything. Mary moved closer to him. You've become a good, successful, generous man. That isn't false. That comes from who you really are inside. How can you be so sure? Because I met you when you were just a scared child, and you already showed that kindness. You shared your food with the younger kids, protected the weaker ones from bullies, always tried to cheer up those who were sad. Edward sat down in one of the armchairs as if the weight of the revelations was physical. Mary, I need to know everything, about my life at the shelter, about what I was like, about what happened before I got there. Everything I know, I will tell you, she promised. But Edward, I also need to warn you about something. What? Helen will notice that something has changed, and if she really knew the truth about your adoption, she might try to prevent you from discovering more. What do you mean? Think about it. If your adoption was irregular, if there are false documents, if money was involved, it could have legal consequences. For her, for the Carter family, for the assets you built together. Edward ran his hands through his hair, that familiar gesture that now made even more sense to Mary. It was exactly what David did when he was worried. Do you think they adopted me just for financial gain? I don't know, Edward. I just know you arrived at the shelter showing signs that you came from a wealthy family, but also with traumas that suggested very difficult situations. What kind of traumas? Mary hesitated. You were very afraid of male authority. You would panic when someone shouted, and whenever you saw blonde women, you would get agitated and start to cry. Helen is blonde, Edward murmured. Yes, and there's one more thing I need to tell you. What is it? You didn't arrive at the shelter alone. There was a woman with you, but she wasn't your mother. Edward lifted his head sharply. How do you know? Because a true mother wouldn't hand over her child the way that woman did. She was nervous, rushed, and lied about finding you on the street, but mainly what? Mainly because you didn't cry when she left. You were relieved. Edward fell silent for a long time, processing this information. If she wasn't, who was my mother? I don't know. But I have my suspicions that she worked for someone who really wanted to get rid of you. Get rid of me? Why? Edward, do you remember anything about your life before you were 8? Any fragments, any feelings? He closed his eyes, concentrating. There are vague images. A very large house with marble stairs, the sound of constant arguments, and... He opened his eyes, surprised. And the smell of expensive perfume mixed with cigarettes, exactly like I dreamed. Anything else? A woman crying, always crying, and a man's voice shouting about money, about inheritances. Mary felt a chill. Edward, it's possible that you weren't abandoned due to lack of resources. It's possible you were removed from a dangerous situation. What do you mean? Either someone wanted to protect you, or someone wanted to get you out of the way. Edward stood up, agitated. Mary, I need to find out who I really am. I need to know where I came from, why I ended up in the shelter, and why the Carters adopted me. This could be dangerous. If there are powerful interests involved, I don't care. I've spent 23 years living a lie. Now I want the truth, no matter the cost. The phone rang, interrupting the conversation. Edward answered with a simple hello, but his expression changed immediately. Helen, he said, looking at Mary. Yes, I'm in the office. What do you mean, where's Robert? No, he's already finished here. All right, I'll see you at home. He hung up and turned to Mary. She wants to know details about the investigation, and she's specifically asking about you. Edward, maybe it's better if I don't come back here for a few days. No, he said firmly. I'm not going to let her push you away from me again. I lost you once. I'm not losing you again. Mary felt her heart warm at his words. So what do we do? We're going to find out the truth, together, as it should have been from the start. Edward picked up the drawing of the shelter's layout that he had unconsciously made. Mary, you said you kept your journals from the time at the shelter? I did. And are there other staff members from that time we can still locate? Some, yes, scattered across other shelters and NGOs. Then that's where we're going to start. I want to go back to the shelter. I want to talk to people who knew me. I want to piece together all the fragments of my story. Mary nodded, but a worry consumed her. If Edward was indeed the child of a powerful family, if there were secrets buried for decades, they wouldn't just be dealing with family lies. They would be meddling with forces that had already shown they were willing to do anything to keep the truth hidden. And Helen, who until now had only been a controlling wife, could reveal herself to be something much more dangerous if she felt her world of privilege threatened. The weekend arrived charged with a different energy. Edward had spent the entire Friday restless, cancelling meetings and asking Mary to stay beyond normal hours to discuss details of his life at the shelter. She shared about her favourite games, her difficulties in school, which had always been few given her exceptional intelligence, and especially about her frequent nightmares and the affectionate way she cared for the younger children. On Saturday morning, Edward called Mary at home. Helen had gone to the salon and would later have lunch with friends, giving them a perfect window of opportunity. Mary, can you meet me in Springfield? I want to visit the place where the shelter used to be. Edward, are you sure? It could be emotionally difficult. I need to do this. I need to see it with my own eyes. 2 hours later, they met at the Peacekeeper Square in downtown Springfield. Edward arrived driving a black BMW, completely out of place in that popular environment. He wore jeans and a polo shirt, trying to look less formal, but still drew attention. Mary was waiting for him sitting on a bench in the square, wearing her best dress, a simple yet elegant navy blue model she saved for special occasions. As she saw him approach, her heart tightened. There was the boy she had raised, now a successful man, about to revisit the childhood that had been erased from his memory. "Thank you for coming," he said, clearly nervous. "You don't need to thank me. That's what mothers are for," she replied, and immediately regretted her words. Edward looked at her with an intense expression. "Is that how you see me? As a son?" "It has always been that way, Edward. Even when I didn't know who you were, something inside me recognized you." They walked through the streets of Springfield, Edward observing everything with heightened attention. At every corner, he seemed to seek memories in familiar places. When they passed an old bakery, he stopped abruptly. "That smell," he murmured, "sweet bread and strong coffee." You always asked me to buy sweet bread from that bakery when we went out, Mary confirmed. It was your only indulgence. I remember, Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. Not clearly, but the feeling is here, as if my body remembers even though my mind can't. They finally arrived at the location where St. Joseph's Home once operated. The building was still there, but it now housed a public school. The facade had been painted blue and white, but the basic structure remained the same. Edward stopped in front of the gates, his hands trembling slightly. "This is it," he said, more to himself than to Mary. "This is it," she confirmed. "Can I go in? It's Saturday, but I know the school principal. She was a teacher here during the time of the shelter. I'll try to talk to her." Half an hour later, Sarah Williams, a 58-year-old black woman with grey hair and a welcoming smile, greeted them in the schoolyard. She had worked as a volunteer teacher at the shelter and now ran the school that operated in the same location. "Mary!" she exclaimed, embracing her friend. "What a joy to see you. And this is—" "Sarah, this is Edward. But you knew him by another name." Sarah looked closely at Edward, and gradually her expression changed from confusion to recognition. "Oh my God," she whispered. "David." Edward nodded, clearly emotional about being recognized. "Boy, how you've grown, and what a handsome man you've become." Sarah embraced him warmly. "I've always wondered what happened to you after you were adopted." "Miss Sarah," Edward said, "I need your help. I don't remember much of my childhood here, and I need to recover those memories." "Of course, dear. Let's go inside. The building is the same. We just changed a few things." They walked through the hallways, and Edward began to recognize spaces with a mix of surprise and melancholy. When they reached what used to be the cafeteria, he stopped and closed his eyes. "Smell of beans and rice," he murmured, "and vegetable soup on Tuesdays." "Exactly," Mary confirmed. "You always complained about the soup, but you ate it all because I told you that you needed to grow strong." Sarah led them to what used to be the dormitories. "David slept in the bed near the window," she said. "He always said he liked to see the stars before sleeping." Edward approached the window and looked outside. The view overlooked a small courtyard with a mango tree in the center. "I used to climb that tree," he said suddenly. "It was my hideout when I was sad." "That's right," Sarah confirmed. "You would spend hours up there, reading or just thinking." "And there was a rope hanging from the lowest branch," Edward continued, memories starting to flow. "The younger kids would line up to swing." Mary felt tears of joy. "You remember. The memories are coming back." They spent 2 hours exploring every corner of the old shelter. Sarah showed old photos she had kept, including some from summer festivals and Christmas celebrations. In one of them, David appeared next to Mary, both smiling as he held a trophy from a soccer championship between shelters. "I remember this photo," Edward said, touching the image. "It was the happiest day of my life until then. You were so proud of me." "And I still am," Mary replied. But it was when they reached the small garden in the back that something extraordinary happened. Edward saw the old water tank still there, and immediately his hand went to his left wrist. "That's where I fell," he said, memories flooding back. "I was trying to grab a kite that had gotten stuck in the antenna, and I took care of your wound every day," Mary added. "You cried, not from pain, but because you were afraid I would be mad at you." "You never got mad," Edward smiled, the first tears streaming down his face. "You always told me that accidents happen, that the important thing was to learn to be more careful." Sarah watched the scene, moved. "David was special," she said. "Different from the other kids, more polite, more refined. We always imagined he came from a middle-class family that had gone through hardships." "Sarah," Mary said, "do you remember how he got here?" "I do. An elegant woman brought him on a rainy night. She said she found him on the street, but the story didn't add up. The child was too clean, well-fed, wearing expensive clothes. And do you remember any more details about this woman? I remember she was very nervous. She kept looking back as if someone was following her, and she had a different accent. She wasn't from New York. Edward stepped closer. What kind of accent? Maybe from Chicago, or maybe from the Midwest. And she mentioned a name during the conversation with the director. What name? Something about a Mrs. Beatrice. She said Mrs. Beatrice had asked her to bring the child here. Edward and Mary exchanged meaningful glances. It was the first concrete clue about who might have orchestrated his arrival at the shelter. Sarah, Edward asked, do you have any records from that time? Anything that could help us understand this story better? I have some old documents stored at home. They were papers the director asked me to keep when the shelter closed. If you want, we can take a look. Please, Edward said. Any information could be important. As they headed to Sarah's house, Edward seemed like a different person. The memories that had returned brought a peace that Mary hadn't seen in his eyes for weeks. But they also brought new, urgent questions. Who was Mrs. Beatrice? Why had she sent an 8-year-old child to a public shelter? And most importantly, what had happened in David's life before he turned 8 that was so terrible it needed to be completely erased? Mary, Edward said as they walked, thank you for not giving up on me. Mothers never give up on their children, Edward, never. Even when they forget who you are, especially in those moments. Edward stopped and hugged her right there in the middle of the street, a tight and lingering embrace that carried 23 years of repressed longing. I remember you now, he whispered in her ear. I remember your scent, your voice singing me to sleep, the way you tied my shoelaces. How could I forget all of this? The important thing is that you remember now, Mary replied, feeling that she had finally regained her son. But as they walked to Sarah's house in search of more clues about Edward's past, neither of them imagined that Helen had discovered where they were, and that at that very moment she was planning a desperate action to prevent the complete truth from coming to light. Sarah's house was a simple 2-story building in a residential neighborhood of Springfield, with light yellow walls and a small garden in front, where roses and hibiscus grew. The interior was cozy, decorated with well-preserved antique furniture and family photographs that told decades of history. Please, have a seat in the living room while I look for the documents, Sarah said, heading to a room that served as an office. I'll make some coffee, too. Edward observed every detail of the house attentively, as if he were trying to absorb the normalcy and affection that emanated from that environment. For someone who had grown up in a luxurious yet cold mansion, the warm simplicity of Mary's home was revealing. Mary, he said, sitting beside her on the floral-patterned sofa, what was my personality like as a child? Was I happy? You were a thoughtful child, she replied, choosing her words carefully. Too intelligent for your age at times. Affectionate with everyone, but always with a sadness in your eyes, as if you carried a weight you couldn't understand. And did I talk about my previous life? Very little. When we asked, you would change the subject or become agitated. But sometimes, when you had a fever or were very tired, you would murmur things in your sleep. What kind of things? Names. You called out for someone named Daddy Robert and for an Aunt Bee, and you always repeated, "Don't leave me alone. Please don't leave me alone." Edward closed his eyes, trying to connect this information with the vague images that had been returning to his mind. Robert, that name sounds familiar. And Bee, could that be Mrs. Beatrice that Mary mentioned? It's possible. Edward, there's something I never told you, but it might be important now. What is it? Once, You had a very strong panic attack. It was when a family came to visit the shelter interested in adoption. The man was wearing an expensive suit and spoke loudly, authoritatively. You hid behind me, trembling, and whispered, "He's going to take me away like the others did." The others? That was exactly my question, but you couldn't explain. You just repeated that you were afraid of men in suits who spoke loudly. Edward was about to respond when they heard the sound of a car stopping in front of the house. Mary appeared at the living room window, frowning. "How strange," she murmured. "A black car with tinted windows. I don't know anyone who has a car like that." Mary felt a chill run down her spine. "Edward, did you tell anyone you were coming here today?" "Only you," he replied, but his expression had changed to one of alertness. "Why?" "Because I think we've been followed." The doorbell rang, echoing through the house, insistent and prolonged. Mary went to answer, and they heard muffled voices. Moments later, she returned to the living room, accompanied by two people who made Edward's heart race. Helen entered first, elegant as always, but with a look of contained fury that Mary had never seen before. Right behind her was a tall, imposing man, around 70 years old, with completely white hair, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than a popular car. His blue eyes had a calculating coldness that made Edward instinctively rise from the sofa. "Edward," Helen said in a dangerously calm voice, "we need to talk, now." "How did you find us?" Edward asked. "Did you really think you could investigate your past without me knowing?" Helen laughed, but there was no humor in her voice. "I installed a tracker on your car months ago, dear, ever since you started acting strangely." The older man stepped forward, and Mary noticed that Edward involuntarily recoiled, as if a primitive instinct warned him of danger. "Edward," the man said in a deep, authoritative voice, "I am Mr. Carter, Helen's father and your father-in-law. I think it's time we had a frank conversation about certain inappropriate investigations you've been conducting." "Dad," Helen said, "these are the people filling Edward's head with fantasies about his past. The woman," she pointed at Mary with disdain, "is the cleaning lady I suspected was manipulating him." Mr. Carter studied Mary with piercing eyes. "So you are the infamous Mary Johnson, the woman who has been planting absurd ideas in my son-in-law's head." "Absurd ideas?" Edward interjected. "Is discovering the truth about my own identity absurd?" "Your identity is Edward Mendez Carter," Mr. Carter stated categorically. "Legally recognized adopted son of our family. Everything else is a fantasy of a disturbed mind." "Disturbed mind?" Edward felt his anger begin to boil. "Or inconvenient memories for you?" Helen stepped closer to him. "Edward, dear, you don't understand what these people are trying to do. They want to take advantage of your success, create an emotional connection story to get money." "Helen!" Edward exploded. "Do you really think Mary wants my money? She has worked in my office for 3 years. If she wanted to extort me, she would have done it long ago." "Edward," Mr. Carter intervened, with a voice that brooked no argument, "you will stop these ridiculous investigations right now. You will dismiss this employee and seek psychiatric help to resolve these delusions about your childhood." "Delusions?" Edward laughed bitterly. "I have documents, Mr. Carter. I know my original name was David Johnson. I know I was adopted at 12 through a questionably quick process." Mr. Carter's expression hardened. "Documents can be interpreted in various ways." "And memories?" Edward continued. "Memories that are returning. Memories of a life you tried to erase from my mind." "Enough!" Mr. Carter slammed his fist on the coffee table, startling Mary. "You will stop this now, Edward. For better or for worse?" "For worse." Edward stepped forward. "Is that a threat?" "It's advice from someone who has the power to make your life very complicated if you insist on this madness." Mary, who had remained silent, finally stood up. "Edward is not your property. He has the right to know who he really is." Helen turned to her with fiery eyes. "And you have the right to be quiet. This is none of your business." "It is my business," Mary replied firmly. "Because I cared for him when he was a child, because I loved him when he needed love, and because I will protect him now, even if it means facing people like you." "People like us?" Helen repeated with disdain. "You have no idea who you are dealing with." "Then let me—" "Tell me," Edward demanded. "Since you know so much about my past, tell me the truth. Who are my real parents? Why was I sent to the shelter? And most importantly, why are you so afraid of me finding out?" Mr. Carter and Helen exchanged glances, and Mary realized there was much more behind this story than she had imagined. "All right," Mr. Carter finally said. "You want the truth? The truth is that you are the son of Robert Miller, my business partner for the past 40 years, a man who built a business empire and had many enemies." Edward went pale. "Robert. I remember that name." "Robert died when you were 8, Mr. Carter continued, "murdered due to involvement in shady dealings. Beatrice, his sister, knew you were in danger. That's why she hid you in the shelter." "And why did you adopt me?" "Because Robert was my friend, and because you had a right to an inheritance that I managed to this day." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward processed the information that he was the son of a murdered man, while Mary began to understand why his adoption had been so urgent and irregular. "What inheritance?" Edward asked. 50% of the company we built together, which is now worth approximately $200 million. Edward sat down again, as if his legs could no longer support him. You adopted me for the inheritance." "We adopted you to protect you," Helen said, but her voice sounded unconvincing, "and to ensure that the money stayed in the family." "Our family," Mr. Carter added, "not strangers who might come forward with sentimental stories about having taken care of you." Edward looked at Mary, then at Helen, then at Mr. Carter. "You lied to me for 23 years. You made me forget my identity, my true history, the people who really loved me." "We did what was necessary," Mr. Carter said coldly. "And now?" Edward stood up, a new determination in his eyes. "What happens now that I know the truth?" "Now," Mr. Carter replied, "you forget this conversation, dismiss this employee, and go back to your normal life, as if none of this ever happened." "And what if I don't do that?" Mr. Carter smiled, but there was no warmth in his expression. "Edward, do you really think a $200 million inheritance can be easily claimed? There are legal ways to challenge mental capacity, to question identity, to make lawsuits very, very complicated." Edward understood the implicit threat. "Would you do that to me? Declare that I'm insane to keep control of the money?" "We will do whatever is necessary to protect our family," Helen said, "as we have always done." It was at that moment that Mary realized they were not just dealing with family lies. They were dealing with people willing to do anything to keep secrets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And Edward was at the center of a conspiracy that had begun 25 years ago with the murder of his true father. The tension in Sarah's small office was palpable. Edward remained standing, processing the revelations about his biological father, while Mr. Carter and Helen awaited his reaction with the predatory patience of those who knew they held all the cards. Mary watched everything with growing concern, realizing that the situation had become much more dangerous than she had imagined. "I need time to process this," Edward finally said, his voice heavy with conflicting emotions. "Finding out that my father was murdered, that my whole life was built on lies—" "They weren't lies," Helen interrupted, approaching him with what seemed to be genuine concern. They were protections. Edward, you were 8 when Robert died. You were traumatized, scared. You couldn't even talk about what had happened. So you decided to erase everything from my memory? We decided to give you a new life, Mr. Carter said. A safe, prosperous life, away from the dangers surrounding the Miller family. What dangers? Edward demanded to know. Mr. Carter hesitated, exchanging glances with Helen. Robert was involved with dangerous people, money laundering, corruption, blackmail. When he was murdered, we discovered that there were many people interested in silencing any heir who might have knowledge of his dealings. And you think an 8-year-old child knew about illegal dealings? Children see and hear things, Mr. Carter replied. And Robert was reckless. He took you to meetings, left documents lying around. You could have information that could compromise very powerful people. Edward turned to Mary. Is that why I arrived at the shelter traumatized? And that's why, Helen added, it was better to leave those memories buried, for your own safety. My safety? Edward laughed bitterly. Or your safety, because if I remembered everything I could question the legitimacy of my adoption and claim my inheritance. The inheritance has always been yours, Mr. Carter said, but there was something defensive in his voice. I have managed it responsibly all these years. Managed it or used it? The silence that followed was revealing. Mary realized that she had hit the core of the entire issue. Edward, she said softly, maybe it's better for you to seek an independent lawyer to clarify the inheritance issue. That won't be necessary, Mr. Carter said quickly. All the documents are in order. Edward has always had access to the financial reports. Reports that you prepared, Edward noted. How can I be sure they reflect reality? Because we are family, Helen exploded. Edward, stop acting like we are criminals. We took care of you, educated you, loved you. Loved? Edward looked directly into her eyes. Helen, when was the last time we talked about something that wasn't business or social appearances? When was the last time you showed any genuine interest in my emotional well-being? Helen looked visibly uncomfortable. We are not demonstrative people, Edward. That doesn't mean we don't care. And would you care if I decided to renounce the inheritance and start a new life? Don't be ridiculous, Mr. Carter said immediately. You can't just renounce $200 million. Why not? It's my money, isn't it? Because, Mr. Carter hesitated, searching for the right words, because there are responsibilities. Edward nodded slowly. I see. You used my inheritance to expand the business, and now you can't return it without jeopardizing the financial empire you built. It's not quite like that. Helen tried to soften the blow. So how exactly is it? Edward pressed. It was Sarah who broke the impasse, returning to the room with a box of old papers and a worried expression on her face. Sorry for the delay, she said, immediately noticing the tension in the room. Did something happen? Mrs. Williams, Edward said, these are my father-in-law and my wife. They came to seek some clarifications about my past. Sarah placed the box on the coffee table and looked distrustfully at Mr. Carter and Helen. As an experienced educator, she had developed a keen instinct for identifying adults who did not have the best interests of children in mind. I found some interesting documents, she said, addressing Edward, including a letter that your Aunt Beatrice left for you, with instructions to be delivered when you turned 25. Mr. Carter stood up abruptly. What letter? A personal letter, Sarah replied, instinctively protective, kept by the staff of the shelter as per Beatrice's own instructions. Where is this letter? Edward asked. Sarah pulled out a yellowed envelope from the box. Here. It said it contained important information about your family and your inheritance. Helen tried to grab the envelope. "Let me see that." "No," Edward said firmly, taking the letter from Sarah's hands. "If it's for me, I will open it." "Edward," Mr. Carter said in a warning tone, "maybe it's better to read this at home, calmly." "Why? Are you afraid of what this letter might say?" Edward tore open the envelope and pulled out several handwritten pages in feminine script. He began to read silently, and Mary saw his expression gradually change from curiosity to shock, then to a rage she had never seen in his eyes. "Edward," Helen said, nervously, "what does the letter say?" Edward looked up, and there was something different about him, a cold, calculating determination that vaguely reminded Mary of the smart, observant boy she had known at the shelter. "It says that my father, Robert, discovered that Mr. Carter was embezzling money from the company," he said slowly. "It says that Robert threatened to report him to the authorities, and it says that Robert was afraid for his life in the days before he died." Mr. Carter turned pale. "These are the fantasies of a woman disturbed by her brother's death." "It also says," Edward continued, ignoring the interruption, "that Beatrice has copies of documents proving the embezzlement, and that she hid those documents in a safe place until I was old enough to claim my inheritance." "Where are those documents?" Helen asked, unable to hide the desperation in her voice. "The letter says that Beatrice would contact independent lawyers when I turned 25 to help me recover what is mine." "Edward," Mr. Carter said, trying to remain calm, "you turned 25 10 years ago. Why hasn't this Beatrice ever shown up?" Edward kept reading. "Because she died," he finally said, "in a car accident, 3 years after writing this letter. But the documents remained with her lawyers in Chicago." The silence that followed was deafening. Mary realized they were facing a revelation that would change everything. Not only had Edward been deprived of his legitimate inheritance, but his adoptive parents were possibly involved in the murder of his biological father. "Edward," Helen said with a trembling voice, "you can't believe these accusations. We are your family." "Family," Edward repeated, looking at her with an expression that Mary had never seen before. "Family doesn't lie for 23 years. Family doesn't steal. And family certainly doesn't kill." "We didn't kill anyone," Mr. Carter protested. "No? Then explain why my father, Robert, died exactly 1 week before a scheduled audit at the company. Explain why you were so eager to adopt me, and explain why you never mentioned the existence of Aunt Beatrice." Edward folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. "Actually, don't explain. I will find out the truth by other means." "Edward," Mr. Carter said, and his voice had lost any pretense of paternal affection, "you are making a very grave mistake. There are forces at play that you don't understand." "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning. There are very powerful people who won't like seeing you meddling in these matters." Edward turned to Mary. "Let's go. I have calls to make." "Edward!" Helen shouted. "If you walk out that door now, if you decide to chase these fantasies, our life together is over." Edward stopped and turned to look at her one last time. "Helen, our life together has always been a lie. It's time we both admit that." As Edward and Mary headed for the door, Mr. Carter made one last attempt. "Edward, think about what you're throwing away. Your social standing, your company, your marriage, all because of unfounded accusations from dead people." Edward paused at the door and turned around. "Mr. Carter, I'd rather be a poor man with dignity than a rich man built on lies and blood." And with those words, he and Mary left Sarah's house, leaving behind not only Helen and Mr. Carter, but the entire life Edward had known until then. Mary knew that the road ahead would be dangerous. If Mr. Carter was indeed involved in Robert's death, he wouldn't hesitate to protect his interests. But as they walked to Edward's car, She felt proud of the brave and principled man that the boy David had become. "Mary," Edward said when they reached the car, "I think we're going to need help. This kind of investigation can be dangerous." "Edward, are you sure you want to go down this path? We might discover even worse things." Edward looked at her with the same determined eyes she remembered from the boy who protected the younger children at the shelter. "Mary, I've spent 23 years living a lie. Now I want to live in the truth, no matter the cost." The days that followed the revelation of the letter were an emotional roller coaster for Edward. He had temporarily moved to a hotel in Manhattan, refusing to return home until he fully clarified his situation. Helen was calling incessantly, alternating between desperate pleas and veiled threats, but he no longer answered her calls. Mary had taken a leave of absence from her job to help Edward on this journey. They spent their days in his office, now transformed into a command center to unravel decades of lies. The walnut desk was covered with copies of documents, notes, and phone numbers of lawyers specializing in inheritance and financial crimes. On Wednesday of that week, they finally made contact with the law firm in Chicago that had represented Beatrice. Dr. Marcus Johnson, an experienced 60-year-old attorney, confirmed that he still held documents related to the Robert Miller case, as per instructions left by Beatrice before her death. "Dr. Edward," he said during a video conference, "your aunt was a very brave woman. She knew she was taking risks by keeping this evidence, but she wanted to ensure that you would one day know the truth." "What kind of evidence?" Edward asked. "Financial spreadsheets, recordings of conversations, copies of contracts, all indicating that Mr. Carter was systematically diverting funds from the Miller and Carter Company to personal accounts abroad. And my father Robert knew about this? He found out 3 months before he died. The recordings show that he confronted Mr. Carter and issued an ultimatum. Either he returned the stolen money and turned himself in to the authorities, or Robert would make the allegations public." Edward closed his eyes. "And a week later, my father was dead. Officially, it was a robbery gone wrong. But Beatrice never believed that version. She hired private investigators who found evidence that the supposed robbers had connections to people close to Mr. Carter." Mary, who was listening to the conversation beside Edward, felt a chill. "Dr. Marcus, did Beatrice ever take this evidence to the police?" "She tried, but Mr. Carter had already used his influence to contaminate the investigation. Moreover, Beatrice was taking care of Edward, a traumatized child, and feared for both their safety." "That's why she hid me in the shelter," Edward murmured. "Exactly. It was a difficult but necessary decision. She planned to come for you when things calmed down and when she had solid evidence to confront Mr. Carter. But she died before that," Edward completed. "Yes, and here's something interesting. Her car accident happened exactly 1 week before a scheduled meeting with federal prosecutors to present the evidence." Edward and Mary exchanged glances. "Do you think her death was also—" "I can't legally assert that, but the coincidences are disturbing." Dr. Marcus explained that he was preparing a complete dossier with all the evidence to present to Edward, but recommended extreme caution. "Dr. Edward, you are dealing with people who have already killed at least once, possibly twice. If they decide that you represent a threat—" "I understand the risks," Edward said, "but I can no longer live knowing that my father was murdered and that his killers are free, living off the money they stole from him." After the video conference, Edward and Mary sat in silence for a long time, absorbing the magnitude of the revelations. It was no longer just about recovering an inheritance or discovering the truth about the past. They were dealing with murder and a conspiracy that had lasted over 2 decades. "Edward," Mary finally said, "maybe we should take all this directly to the federal police. With what evidence? Recordings from 25 years ago, suspicions from a dead woman. Mr. Carter has enough resources and influence to discredit anything we present. So what do we do? Edward stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city sprawling below him. We will use his own arrogance against him. How? Mr. Carter thinks he has complete control over me. He thinks I can be intimidated or manipulated as I always have been. He has no idea that I have access to Beatrice's evidence. Edward, this could be very dangerous. I know, but I have a plan. Edward turned to her with a determined expression that closely resembled the brave boy who defended the younger children in the shelter. Mary, would you trust me if I asked you to do something that might seem crazy? I've always trusted you, she replied without hesitation. Then I will arrange a dinner with Helen and Mr. Carter. I will pretend to accept their explanations and that I want to come home. Edward, this is madness. If they suspect, they won't suspect, because it's exactly what they expect from me. The Edward they know has always given in to family pressures. He always chose the easier path. But you are no longer that Edward. They don't know that, and as long as they believe they can manipulate me, I will have the advantage of surprise. Mary was about to protest when Edward's phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hello? He answered. Dr. Edward? The voice on the other end was young and nervous. This is Michael, your stepson. Edward was surprised. Michael, Helen's son from her first marriage, was 17 and rarely spoke to Edward beyond the polite greetings required by family coexistence. Michael, how did you get this number? I got it from my mom's phone. Dr. Edward, I need to talk to you urgently. About what? About the things that are happening, about my mom and my grandfather. I know some things that you might need to know. Edward straightened up. What kind of things? I can't talk over the phone. They might be listening. Can I meet you somewhere? Edward looked at Mary, who had noticed the importance of the call by the change in his expression. Michael, are you okay? You're not being pressured by anyone. No, Dr. Edward. In fact, it's the opposite. I'm tired of seeing them treat you badly, and there are things they've done, things that aren't right. Edward made a quick decision. Meet me at the cafe on 5th Avenue in an hour. Meet me at the mall in Manhattan, in the food court, in 2 hours. Come alone. Thank you, Dr. Edward. It's important, very important. After hanging up, Edward turned to Mary. I think we've just gained an unexpected ally. The boy might be used by them to lure you into a trap. It's possible, but Gabriel has always been different, more sensitive, more observant, and he's right about one thing. Helen and Mr. Carter never treated me well, even when I was obedient. Edward, if we're going to meet him, we should go together. I agree. And Mary, maybe it's time we start recording our conversations too. If we're going to play their game, we need to protect ourselves. 2 hours later, Edward and Mary waited nervously in the food court of the mall. Gabriel appeared right on time, a tall and slender teenager, with his mother's dark hair but sensitive eyes, suggesting a completely different personality. Dr. Edward, he said, sitting down at the table with them. Thank you for coming. Gabriel, before anything else, are you safe? Does anyone suspect you're here? I am. I told them I was going to the movies with friends. I have a few hours. Edward discreetly activated his phone's recorder. All right. What did you want to tell me? Gabriel took a deep breath, as if preparing to leap off a cliff. Dr. Edward, I know my mother and my grandfather are lying to you, and I know you're not really a Carvalho. Edward and Mary exchanged surprised glances. How do you know that? Because I overheard them, and talking last night. They were discussing how to prevent you from discovering the truth about your heritage, and my grandfather said... Gabriel hesitated, visibly disturbed. What did he say, Gabriel? He said that if you kept investigating, he might have to take the same drastic measures he took with Robert and Beatrice. Edward's blood ran cold. He said that? Exactly those words? Not exactly, but that's what he meant. And my mother didn't protest, Dr. Edward. She just asked if it would be safe, if it wouldn't leave traces. Mary felt her heart race. The suspicions were confirming. Mr. Carter had not only stolen Edward's heritage, but had also ordered the murder of his father and aunt. Gabriel, Edward said carefully, do you understand the gravity of what you're telling me? I do, and that's why I decided to speak up. Dr. Edward, I've always known there was something wrong with our family. Too much money, too many secrets, too many conversations that stopped when I got close. Why are you helping me? They are your family. Gabriel looked directly into Edward's eyes. Because you've always been kind to me, even though I'm just the stepson, and because I think my grandfather is a very dangerous man. I'm afraid of him, Dr. Edward. Edward leaned over the table. Gabriel, would you be willing to repeat what you told me to the authorities? If it helps protect you? Yes. Even knowing it could destroy your family? Dr. Edward, Gabriel said with surprising maturity for his 17 years, if my family is capable of killing people for money, then maybe it's time for it to be destroyed. Edward looked at Mary, who nodded almost imperceptibly. They had found not only an ally, but a witness willing to confirm the worst suspicions about Mr. Carter and Helen. All right, Gabriel, Edward said, then let's do this the right way. We'll go to the authorities, present all the evidence, and ensure that justice is served. And then, Edward smiled for the first time in days, the three of us will start new lives based on truth and the courage to do what's right. Mary held Edward's hand and Gabriel's, forming an unlikely but powerful circle of people willing to face forces much greater than themselves for the simple conviction that the truth is always worth it. 6 months after the revelations that changed their lives forever, Edward walked along Coney Island Beach next to Mary, watching the sun set on the golden horizon. The legal process had been long and painful, but justice had finally prevailed. Mr. Carter was in jail awaiting trial for murder and money laundering, while Helen had negotiated a plea deal that resulted in house arrest and the loss of all her assets. Did you imagine you would get this far when you decided to tell me the truth? Edward asked, stopping to contemplate the waves kissing the sand. I imagined you deserved to know who you really are. Mary replied, adjusting the shawl over her shoulders, but I confess I didn't expect it to be so complicated. Edward smiled. Complicated is an understatement. Discovering that my entire life was based on lies, that my father was murdered, that my wife was involved, there were moments when I thought about giving up. But you didn't give up. No. And do you know why? Mary looked at him with curiosity. Because you taught me when I was a child that the truth can hurt, but it's what sets us free. And I needed to free myself from a prison I didn't even know existed. They resumed walking, passing families enjoying the late afternoon on the beach. Edward had changed a lot in the past few months. The tense man, tormented by nightmares, had given way to someone more serene, more authentic. He had regained not only his identity, but also his humanity. How are you adapting to your new life? Mary asked. Edward laughed. It's still strange waking up in a simple apartment in Brooklyn instead of a mansion in Manhattan. But it's a good kind of strange. It's real. After officially recovering his heritage, which Mr. Carter had significantly reduced, through his embezzlements, but which still represented a considerable fortune, Edward had made a decision that surprised everyone. He allocated most of the money to create a foundation dedicated to supporting shelters and children in vulnerable situations. The Robert Miller Foundation is running better than we expected, he continued. We've already managed to renovate 3 shelters in New York, and we're expanding. to other states. Your father would be proud. I hope so. And do you know who has been essential to the project? Michael. Michael. Who would have thought that shy and scared boy would become one of the most dedicated advocates for children's rights? He is preparing for law school, wanting to specialize in human rights. Michael had become like a son to Edward after the traumatic events that shattered his family. The young man chose to stay with Edward instead of accompanying Helen during her house arrest, and he thrived in an environment where he could be authentic and work for causes he truly believed in. "And how are things at work?" Mary asked. Edward had sold his stake in the consulting firm and was now working as the executive director of the foundation itself. It was a job that gave him purpose and meaning, very different from the empty life of superficial success he had led before. "Yesterday, I visited the new shelter in Newark," he shared. "Mary, you should have seen the sparkle in those children's eyes when we announced the improvements we are going to implement. It reminded me of the boy you were at St. Joseph's Home." "Exactly. It reminded me of myself at 8 years old, hoping someone cared enough to make a difference." They stopped at a kiosk to drink coconut water, and Edward looked at Mary with deep gratitude. "You know that none of this would have happened if you hadn't had the courage to tell me the truth, right? Edward, I just did what any mother would do for her child." "Mother," he repeated, savoring the word. "Can I make a request?" "Of course." Edward took a deep breath. Would you accept to officially be my mother? I want you to adopt the surname Miller. I want you to be legally recognized as my family." Mary felt her eyes fill with tears. "Edward, Mary, you raised me when I needed love. You taught me values that have guided me throughout my life, even when I had forgotten where they came from. And now you are helping me build something that honors my father's memory and brings justice to the children who are going through what I went through." I would be honored," she managed to say through her tears. "But are you sure? A family is built, not inherited." "Exactly, and I choose you, Mary. I choose to have you as my mother, as my family, as the most important person in my life." They embraced there on the beach, and Mary felt that she had finally closed the circle that had begun 25 years earlier, when a scared boy arrived at St. Joseph's Home needing love and protection. "And there's one more thing," Edward said as they separated. "What?" "I want you to be the educational director of the foundation. No one understands the needs of children in shelters better than you." Mary was surprised. "Edward, I don't have a college degree. You have something much more valuable, practical experience and genuine love. And if you want, we can arrange for you to attend college for education or social work. The foundation can cover the costs." "Going back to school at 51, she laughed. "Why not? It's never too late to fulfill dreams." Mary thought for a moment. Throughout all those years caring for the children at the shelter, she had dreamed of having more formal knowledge to help them even more effectively. Now, for the first time in her life, she had that opportunity. "I accept," she said, "both the adoption and the work at the foundation." "And college?" "Yes, too. It will be strange having a younger son helping me with my studies," she laughed. "It will be great. Michael can help, too. He is always studying for the entrance exam." They resumed their walk, and Mary realized how life had come full circle. The boy she had cared for at the shelter was now taking care of her, offering opportunities she had never dared to dream of. "Edward," she said, "have you thought about starting your own family? Marrying again? Having children?" He became thoughtful. "To be honest, I'm happy as I am now. I have you. I have Michael. I have the work at the foundation that gives me purpose. If romantic love comes naturally, great. but I'm not looking for it. I'm enjoying this phase of discovering who I really am. And who are you really? Edward smiled. I am David Miller, son of Robert Miller and adopted son of Mary Miller. I am Michael's older brother. I am someone who believes that all children deserve love, care, and opportunities. And I am someone who is finally living an authentic life. And are you happy? Happier than I ever thought possible. The sun had completely set, and the city lights began to turn on. They walked toward Edward's apartment in Brooklyn, where Michael was waiting for them with dinner. Ready? A tradition they had created of cooking together on weekends. Mary, Edward said as they arrived at the building, thank you. For what this time? For everything. For loving me when I was a child. For having the courage to tell me the truth when you found me again. For helping me discover who I really am. But mostly for teaching me that family is not about blood or money. It's about love, care, and the mutual choice to be present in each other's lives. Mary held Edward's face in her hands, as she used to do when he was little and needed comfort. Edward David, my heart's son, she said, you have no idea the pride I feel in having participated in the formation of the wonderful man you have become. And the greatest gift life has given me is this second chance to be by your side. They entered the building hand in hand, a reconstructed family not by genetics or money, but by genuine love and the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. In the apartment, Michael awaited them with a radiant smile, the table set, and the smell of feijoada, a recipe that Mary had taught them both and had become the official dish of family gatherings. How was the outing? Michael asked. Great, Edward replied. And we have news to share. What news? Mary is officially going to become my adoptive mother, and our family will finally have all the paperwork in order. Michael hugged Mary enthusiastically. That's amazing. I always knew you two were truly mother and son. During dinner, they talked about the plans for the foundation, Michael's studies, and the new college that Mary would be starting. They were simple, everyday conversations, but filled with a love and authenticity that had never existed in the luxurious mansion where Edward had lived with Helen and Mr. Carter. When they said goodbye that night, Mary heading to her home in Brooklyn and Michael to his study room, Edward was left alone in the living room, contemplating the photographs that decorated the space. They were no longer staged photos from social events, but genuine images. He and Mary visiting shelters, Michael receiving a Best Student medal from school, the three of them together during a picnic in Central Park. It was a simple, authentic life, based on solid values and genuine relationships. It was finally a real life. Edward picked up the phone and called Dr. Mark in Chicago, who had become not only his lawyer, but also a close friend. Mark, how is the progress of the case? Everything is going well, Edward. Mr. Carter will likely get at least 20 years, and the investigations revealed a much larger corruption network than we imagined. You did the right thing. And the other shelters in the network that the Foundation intends to help? The contracts are being finalized. Next month you will be able to announce the expansion to 5 more cities. Great, Mark, thank you so much for everything. So, Edward, can I ask you a personal question? Sure. Do you regret anything? Discovering the truth? Losing the comfortable life you had? Edward looked out the windows of his simple apartment, seeing the city lights that he now knew from a completely different perspective. Mark, for the first time in my life, I wake up every day knowing exactly who I am and why I am here. I have a family that truly loves me and a job that gives meaning to my existence. How could I regret that? That's a beautiful answer. It's a true answer. After hanging up, Edward went to the balcony and looked at the city that stretched as far as his eyes could see. Somewhere down there were children like he had once been, lost, scared, needing love and protection. And tomorrow, just like every day since he discovered his true identity, he would wake up ready to make a difference in their lives. That was the greatest legacy his father Robert had left him. Not the money that Mr. Carter had tried to steal, but the responsibility to use. His privileged position to protect those who needed it most. And that was the greatest lesson Mary had taught him, that true love does not possess, but frees, does not hide the truth, but offers the courage to face it. Edward smiled at the stars that were beginning to appear in the New York sky. Finally, after 35 years, he was living the life that was truly his. Please like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and if you watched until here, comment, "I watched until here," and leave your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the final screen. It's very exciting.